Ja, wenn Fragen auf Deutsch sind, dort musst du übersetzen. Good afternoon, hi, and welcome everybody to our In Dialogue event today. Today is the fourth event of this series discussing new developments and concepts in the field of migration broadly and social and cultural difference. It is hosted by the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity here in Göttingen. And today, our event is entitled and engages with the question, Navigating a Political Minefield, Researching Muslim and Jewish Encounters. And this particular event features some researchers who are engaged in the ongoing international research project, Muslim-Jewish Encounter, Diversity and Distance in Urban Europe, Religion, Culture and Social Model, and which carries out research in cities in the UK, in France, and Germany, and of which we will hear more about in the course of this event. Today, we also want to engage with the broader question of how to do research on a politically sensitive topic and how to navigate this research in a specific political climate. With me today is a great panel of 4 panelists, 3 of them in presence and 1 online, whom I would like to introduce to you now. With us is Riem Spielhaus. She's a professor for Islamic studies at the University of Göttingen, but predominantly she's a research group leader of various projects at the Leibniz Institute and the Georg Eckert Institute for Educational Media in Braunschweig. Here her main focus is on the project Knowledge in Transition, focusing on representation of minorities, specifically of Islam, religious diversity, antisemitism in educational textbooks in Germany. She's also part of the research project RADIS, which we will hear more about hopefully in the course of this event, and she has published and researched widely on Muslim representations, Muslim communities, and issues of identification and ascription in Germany and beyond. So
Thank
welcome.
you for the invitation.
Our second speaker and panelist is Nonna Mayer. She's a professor and research director emerita of the National Center for Scientific Research at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics of Sciences Po in Paris. And she's chaired the French Political Science Association and is a member of the French National Consultative Commission for Human Rights since 2017, and co-PI for its annual survey on racism, antisemitism, and xenophobia. She's a renowned expert on these issues in France and internationally, and is also part of the Encounters project. Our third speaker is Dekel Peretz. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Max Weber Institute of Sociology of Heidelberg University and associated with the MPI here, and his current research focuses on Muslim-Jewish encounters in the context of Berlin, so he's part of the joint research project, Muslim-Jewish Encounters. And also with us today is Sami Everett. He's a research coordinator for the cross-national research project that I mentioned, Muslim-Jewish Encounters, and he has done research on Sephardic Jews in the context of France and Algeria. So welcome, or join me to welcome this great panel today. Well, finally, I should probably also introduce myself. My name is Vanessa Rao, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at this institute, also engaged with the Encounters project, and I've worked on Jewish communities and Israeli migration in the past, and currently I predominantly focus on migration and intimacy. So all of our guest speakers or our panelists today have research experience either in France or Germany. And in the course of this event, we would like to look at or discuss the questions in those 2 contexts. So establish differences in similarities also between the 2 contexts, the 2 political climates. And thinking about Jews and Muslims in France and Germany, what often comes to mind are questions of antisemitism, of anti-Muslim racism, the political instrumentalization of those issues, not seldom related to migration. And recently in Germany, for example, we witnessed discussions around the arts display at the Documenta, the great art exhibition, and we also witnessed how questions of anti-Semitism create discomfort in the public sphere. In France, on the other hand, there's rarely a year that goes by without another debate on religious symbols or the discussion of ethnic minorities in the public sphere, often related to Muslims, and how to incorporate minorities in the national body. So to start us off, in our title we used the metaphor of the minefield. So that literally means stepping on an item that's not visible from the outside and being threatened by a potential explosion. So my question, firstly, I would like to ask our guests, what actually are we talking about when we talk about the minefield in doing research on Jews and Muslims? And I would like to address sort of the French context first and ask Nonna. Nonna, you have also been accused of Islamo-gauchisme in the French context. So maybe you can tell us about the minefield in France and also address this issue.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I tried to show the French context and what is exactly that concept of Islamo-leftism, which is the major mine. So it goes back to the Second Intifada in the year 2000, when it started a very violent aggressions against French Jews, and it started also the debate of a new antisemitism, a new Judeophobia, masked behind the mask of anti-Zionism, and that would be migrating from the extreme right to the left and the extreme left of the political spectrum. And there appears the concept of Islamo-gauchism, coined by a researcher, a philosopher, and political scientist, Pierre-André, who wrote his book in 2002, 2 years after the explosion of the Second Intifada, and he called his book The New Judeophobia. And for him, at the time, Islamo-leftism meant something. He meant that around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there was an alliance or a convergence between activists that were defending Islam and sometimes radical Islam, and between extreme left who were fighting for the rights of the Palestinian in an anti-imperialist vision. At that time, the concept made sense. Then it was forgotten for a couple of years, and the only people who used that concept were the right. It's in the Figaro that half of the usages of the term have been counted until very recently, and the CNews people, which is a right-wing, very right-wing TV. And then it came back to the surface after the assassination of the teacher Samuel Paty in October 2020. Then our Minister of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, started a crusade against Islamo-leftism in the French university. And what does it mean? It means he was accusing the French university to be intellectually complice of terrorism. And it goes beyond that because it's arm against social sciences, accused of political activism, of giving priority to Muslims and to prejudice against Muslims, using the word of Islamophobia, which for people like Jean-Michel Blanquer means that you haven't the right to criticize Islam, which is not at all the case, and that the people who work on Islamophobia and use the term are minimizing anti-Semitism. And what's interesting, it is now the concept has gone even further beyond Islamo-leftism. It's going against the idea that the people who work on that have important theories from the US, and it mixes together in the same bag people who work on gender, intersectionality, race, decolonization. All that makes of us, because I'm part of these researchers working on prejudice against migrants and against Muslims, enemies of the French Republic, which is secular, universalist. We are supposed to be promoting communities, false identities. That's the state of the debate today. And the problem is that accusation of Islamo-leftism has moved from the right to the left, or the center-left, Jean-Michel Blanquer and Macron, and also that it is dividing deeply the milieu of intellectual and research, because a few days after Blanquer's expression, there were 100 intellectuals who signed in the journal Le Monde a manifesto against Islamo-leftism. So we are really in a real minefield.
Thank you, Nonna. I think, yeah, we thank you for sketching that out. I think we will come to your research later on and discuss how that impacts your research. But maybe we can relate it now to the context of Germany, Riem and Dekel. What is how would you compare the minefield here?
Yeah. I see here similarities in the sense that the research is being politicized also here in Germany. Research on Jewish-Muslim relations and encounters is touching the heart of the German narrative since unification, a narrative that is focused greatly on an historical never again, on bilateral relations between Jews and Christian Germans that is focused on commemoration of the Holocaust. And Nonna pointed out issues of intersectionality, pluralism in society that are also influencing the German discourse today. Statistically speaking, over a quarter of people residing in Germany have migration background, meaning that either they or one of their parents migrated to Germany. And this concept of German being a post-migratory society is coming in play and, in a sense, questioning that narrative of a bilateral relationship between majority society and a main minority, which is the Jewish minority. And this influences many different debates that have been happening in Germany in the past years. Vanessa mentioned the Documenta debate, which is the most recent in a series of issues around this narrative. Another major debate was around the singularity of the Holocaust, or should the Holocaust be perceived by researchers as a part of a broader post-colonial research? Should it be, or can it be, and should it be compared with other genocides in other places in the world? And it also connects to questions around imported antisemitism, which with it already conveys an idea that these Jewish-German relations have reached a point where antisemitism supposedly no longer exists between a majority society and of course the term majority society is already problematic in this context. So that the question of imported antisemitism, difference of antisemitism to mostly Muslims, and the issue of Muslim antisemitism comes to play. And also this question of can and how can minorities relate to this narrative, to this, to the question of the Holocaust. Can it be compared with other genocides or other, most recently, can Syrian migrants compare it with what they have been through? Can Bosnians compare it with the genocide? Can this memorial culture be used as in a way to continue a certain form of integration, or is this memorial culture still monolithic and singular? So these are questions that come and then open, with its comparisons, also doors for instrumentalization. if that can be compared, then how far can this issue of comparison go, as we saw in the time of the Corona protests, with yellow stars of David by demonstrators against the Corona. And then the question if this narrative is open to different perspectives, how far can it be open? So this is just sketching some of the issues that come and open up very different minefields, but also, in a way, act as a way of silencing other perspectives. For example, is a commemorance of the Holocaust, does it allow room for discussions about the Nakba? Is Germany's standing with Israel disallowing spaces or closing spaces for other minority groups within this conversation, and the ability for them to express their voices. And last but not least is the BDS resolutions in 2019 of the German parliament that, in a way, take that issue of silence and the question of the possibility of free speech around different issues and put it in question. So these are all different minefields that can be stepped on by researchers in the field.
There's quite a few.
I would like to add some.
I was just going to
Yeah.
I was trying to leave some.
I mean, they're already a lot, and they're already really heavy. But if I now look into researching Muslim communities, Islamic communities, mosques, etc., and people who are active there, then you add to that whole field another minefield, which is in the field of extremism and radicalism, and that puts up a lot of discussions that we actually have in this. Federal ministry funded research line, where one RAD is Radical Islam, which already shows how much funding is politicizing our research, and since a long time, actually, more than 15 years, I would say, in the field of Islam in Germany or Islam in Europe, you can see that funding lines are heavily influencing what gets researched, what gets funded, etc., and how it is named and how it is framed. So within actually this large research group or as association, we are often criticizing already the framing that has been done by political actors, while seeking our freedom to navigate research within that. And the smaller group that I'm working with in this is RIRA, called RIRA, Radical Islam and Radical Anti-Islam, looking into the co-radicalization processes. Okay, just mentioning that. But within the larger research group, we have a lot of issues that come up for researchers. And one is, of course, so how do you navigate in a field of extremism where perhaps there is anti-Semitism or there are anti-Semitic narratives coming up, right? Where there might be really problematic political expressions alongside, or people navigating, actually, people who are trying to find a place within this really, I mean, even for very well-skilled, educated people, it's very difficult to navigate this field of memory culture, actually, right? Where a lot of people are very, very careful in their wording and whether they actually address the topic or not, which I do, in general, for Germany, find quite problematic. I think we should be able to much more creatively or freely engage with the issue of how we commemorate, how we deal with current stereotypes, etc., and even worse tendencies in the society. But what happens is that people hold back because of the framing. But when you look into extremism studies, then you're looking into risks for the researcher. I mean, if you do go into extremist organizations or structures and milieus, which are often not real organizations, right? And that's that's looking very dangerous. And actually, we don't have real support for researchers. And nevertheless, sometimes in the public debate, I sense an expectation that researchers should stop terrorism. And I say, well, that's not our job. That's really not our responsibility. We do have actually other bodies in the society that are responsible for that, right? And so I do believe in the split of responsibilities in this field. And then we have so when you come up, especially when you do publish something or when you get questions, interviews by the media, then it's. But even if you do publish a research in the academic field, you have to be very careful about what do you bring up. And this also, when you go, when you go into empirical research with anthropological methods, then you have to deal as well. You have to be very aware of how this minefield is having perhaps very, very heavy influence on what you hear, on what people tell you, and on how people are careful or not, and what your role is then as a researcher who does hopefully believe in do no harm to the field that you're researching. And I think it's even getting more difficult, and luckily I've never come across such a problem. If you really come across problematic things, then what do you do? And so we have a support group now within this big research group for people actually to there's no supervision, for instance, as you have in psychology when you work as a psychologist. And sometimes we do hear stories, especially when you work on migration, you hear stories that are really frightening, that are really shocking, that you have to deal with as a person. I really have a great respect for researchers, historians who research the Holocaust. I think people who do that need supervision, right? In the sense of consultation with psychologists, for instance. That doesn't exist for us as researchers. And the second thing, and then I'm stopping, sorry for being so long, but another thing that we don't have is support when a shitstorm is coming or when a media a wave is coming. There is no support for that, and there's nearly no support for hate letters and death threats. And I do know several researchers who get regularly death threats, who work, for instance, on right-wing extremism, antisemitism, or on Islamic extremism.
And that's only part of the potential explosion, you would say. When we're still keeping the metaphor of the minefield. Exactly. The explosion is...
yes, we do have the symbolic explosion as a threat, and we do actually really have a real explosion as well as a threat, right?
Yeah. Hearing about this context, Sami, can you compare it to, is it comparable to France and also to what Nonna has said?
Yes. It brings to mind certain kind of anecdotes from the field, as it were. So prior to the Encounters project, about relations, interactions, intercultural, interfaith encounters between Jews and Muslims, I worked on a project predominantly in Paris, but also in the rest of France, about interfaith dialogue between Jews and Muslims, and it was funded by the BCC, and BCC is BCC, Bureau Central des Cultes, so the Central Bureau for Faiths plural, in France. And I did a lot of very emotionally draining research. So, anecdotally, and stripping out, who it was with, etc., for the purposes of confidentiality, one interview that I conducted with an organization that was working on educating women in low socioeconomic indicator neighborhoods on antisemitism in what's known as les quartiers, or the neighborhoods in France. somebody told me that they believed that everybody in les quartiers were anti-Semitic. And so les quartiers, it's important to say les quartiers, meaning the neighborhoods, is a slightly racialized trope for talking about kind of black and brown, predominantly Muslim people in France. And so the belief, the founding belief of this institution was that everybody in les quartiers was anti-Semitic. And so one had to get to the mothers of those people in order to change minds, right? And I found this both profoundly pessimistic, but also very, very draining, because there's a sort of essentialized belief in some of the rhetoric that's very present today. And I found myself, after that interview, having to call like my personal support group, who are not psychologists, you know. So effectively calling friends, but friends that understood, friends with whom I could speak freely. So that's one part, and I completely agree with you. When it affects yourself, and often there's an implication of the self in ethnographic type research, it can be very difficult emotionally to hear certain things and to process that information, right? We can't just process by writing, we need to process also by speaking. The second thing was that, as you will imagine, the Bureau Central des Cultes is part of the Ministère de l'Intérieur, so this bureau is within the ministry, so this comes to your funding point, right? So being somebody that wants to explain the point of view from which I'm coming, I always explained where the funding stream was coming from. And that was intensely problematic to interlocutors, right? Some people became gave, I think, a face to me in that particular circumstance, in that particular interview, that I wouldn't have found in other circumstances.
Could you explain that? I mean,
what I mean by that is there was antipathy toward me as a representative of the state. So when engaging with groups that feel marginalized, for example, on the far left, but not only, also, kind of Muslim activist groups, I found that I was getting a kind of quite aggressive type discourse that outside of that kind of a relationship, interviewee, interviewer, I wouldn't have ordinarily had. And then the other thing was those people that are also marginalized. So for example, I interviewed somebody who works in the northern districts of Marseille, who is a Jewish religious leader, who works with a lot of local Muslim groups, and he basically wants. I put everything down on paper and sent it to him. He said, I can't really let you use that information. I don't want that in going into the report. And yet it's, to my mind, absolutely vital to show that against all expectations, there are actually instances of on-the-ground, grassroots work going on between poorer people, both of Jewish and Muslim identity. So, yeah, it's intensely problematic. I mean, I completely concur with what you were saying, Riem.
So I think we are establishing the Minefield by also looking already at research, and that was the next question: how do we navigate that field academically? And we already touched upon it, but I'm going to ask Nonna, because she's on screen and you have done research in Sarcelles, and maybe you can tell us how you navigated that context given the minefield that you explained before.
Yes, so it's Sarcelles is something. I am a member of the National Commission for Human Rights, and every year they have money to make a national survey on a representative sample of the population living in France, which gives us information since 1990 on the evolution of prejudice of all kinds. So that's already something important to count on, because it gives us a fantastic measuring instrument. And we are the target of all the criticism, because they say we are biased, we only look at the prejudice against minorities, but what about the prejudice against French and against white, etc. But every year we have that survey, and it gives us a way to answer. Yet, with my colleague Vincent Tiberi, we had the impression that we had to go further. We cannot just work on a national sample. We wanted to do fieldwork, local fieldwork, and everyday relations. Beyond what you say to the interviewer, what happens in your everyday life? What are your networks of sociability? Do you go out for dinner with people of another religion? Where do you want to be buried? Who are your friends? And so we decided to make another survey, but a local survey on the phone in Sarcelles. Sarcelles was part of the Red Belt, the ex-communist suburbs around Paris. It's a very multicultural city. It's 60,000 people, but there you must have something like almost 100 different religions. You have, almost 100 nationalities and at least 15 religions. And they have sheltered wave after wave of immigration and refugees. So that gives it, it's like a magnifying glass of inter-minority, inter-groups relations, and Jews and Muslims among. So we decided to make the survey there, and instead of working only on the Jews or only on the Muslims, we decided to take a sample representative of the whole city of Sarcelles. And it's very interesting because there Catholics are a minority. You only have minorities in Sarcelles. And we wanted to see how they live together. And we asked very concrete questions. When you go to dinner with somebody with another religion, do you accept? Well, 0%, practically one person out of our sample of over 800 said they wouldn't go. Some said we would ask, we wouldn't eat all the food if it wasn't conform to our religion, but they didn't refuse. Two, when we asked the people they see, the real problem was social. Social class was the most important cleavage, not the religious cleavage to determine with whom we go out and who are our friends. The only group who felt more separate, it was the Jews of Sarcelles, which are Sephardic Jews. They were the only group who put religion just before class, while Muslims put gender in second position. You see that there was a sociability of men and of women. So it's a more contrasted image than people walled in their different groups. And three, we had experiments about anti-Semitism. We didn't ask them about the usual stereotypes. We had a sample and we told the same story, but we changed the target. It's about cartoons. It was before the assassination of Samuel Paty. And we asked in the schoolroom, one of the pupils has disseminated cartoons. And the first group, it was anti-Jews, the other one anti-Muslims, the other one anti-Christians. And we wanted to see what were the reactions. And the group that was and what should be should we expel the pupil? Well, it's anti-Semitism that was the most condemned. In that multicultural city, the taboo on anti-Semitism was still there. So all that to show that in everyday relations, Sarcelles is not a place of hate and detestation and separatism. Jews are afraid because there were riots, and yet 90% say they're happy in Sarcelles. Over 80% say they can exercise freely their religion. So going to the field, local field, you see that reality is far more complex. And that's what we must fight for, to disseminate the results of this research against the usual stereotypes of the Islam of the suburbs, the Islam of the Muslims, the anti-Semitism of the suburbs, the anti-Semitism of the Muslims. Reality is far more complicated.
So speaking about navigating that academically, what are the resonances you had for those results? Have you had any yet? From the public, Nonna?
We have presented the research several times. We haven't yet written the book with Vincent. We want to do now more qualitative, have more qualitative data. I'm starting interviews, so that's going to take a little longer. But it was very well accepted. So it's our best way to fight against those who despise us, because we must face the reality. There is a real witch hunt against social sciences in France today. And it started in 2015 with Manuel Valls, then Prime Minister, saying that social sciences put forward the culture de l'excuse, that we were excusing terrorism and other and delinquents. It was Emmanuel Macron, the president, who said that we are ethnicizing society in the way we approach the problems. And it's Blanquer and Vidal, our ministers, who say we are Islamo-leftists. So our best weapon is to patiently and decidedly go on with our research, define our terms, and say that we are not politicized. We are not a pseudoscience. Just maybe to finish, there's an observatory of decolonialism and identitarian ideologies, and they are leading the attacks, and they have researchers there, intellectuals, and their motto, they say, this site is an observatory, and its aim is to fight against the promotion of antisemitism, sexism, racism by the pseudoscience that we are, and to defend the principles that depend of the university, school, secularism, etc. So that's how we must fight, not engage debate with them, just go on with our research and show how reality is.
Would that also be your approach?
I mean, yeah, Nonna, it's very, very interesting and also shocking to hear that from France. I think we do have a little bit different discourse here in Germany, but what I would say is that we are not alone. In a way, in a fatalistic way, reality is been denied in other fields as well. If we look into climate, of course, research on climate change or on the environment, if we look into issues of, for instance, other environmental research within the field of agriculture, etc. Right? If we look into education research and so on, so there's a lot of actually research fields today, even in the field of natural sciences, and not only in social sciences, that are facing similar issues in the context of being accused of being ideological, etc. So I think one other suggestion that I would have is to work together, or to think also together with researchers from other fields that face similar but different, of course, accusations, and that try to speak about the reality, but are accused of being blind or ideological, etc.
And does it also depend on the positionality of the researcher?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's a very good point that many different scientific fields are being politicized. I think also you cannot separate the researcher totally from the political beliefs that are also being shaped by the research. In my, I mean, and also the fact that researchers like myself are members of the communities that they are researching. So on the one hand, there is the fear of being identified with certain with politics. There is this wish to be a scientist, whatever that, with this aura of objectivity. I come from history, that tradition of a supposed objectivity is strong in my approach, but also it's very clear that people have expectations for me within the community of all different sorts of, with all different political approaches. And I notice it when I present things that, and I really try to bring the complexity of the field into the research. For example, that political alliances, pro-Palestine or pro-Israel, are both Jewish and Muslim alliances. They're not really cut along those lines. That sometimes the future does not seem optimistic for me as a researcher doing Jewish-Muslim relations in certain conditions. Then I notice sometimes that I disappoint other researchers while presenting this research and maybe encourage others. So none of the researchers, as Nonna also pointed out, none of the researchers are totally cut from the funding from different political agendas that shape this field.
So is there rigorous academic research then?
Is there, or is this?
Is there? I mean, like, what are the
Of course there is, and I
possibilities?
think the problem is actually that populist discourses, which are rising in general in the whole world, are not interested in complexity. That's our problem. That's the problem for any rigorous research actually today.
And maybe I'll give another example from our field research, is that when I went into the field research, I tried to keep it very superficial in the sense that we said, we are trying to get away from the larger narratives, the narratives that everybody knows about the conflict between Jews and Muslims. And I tried to look at culture, at music, at everyday encounters, at religious encounters that are on a theological level and not on this political level. But in the reality, I saw that conflicts do arise and are dealt with by all the different actors in different ways. That doesn't mean that they live in conflict. It means that the conflict is a part of this discussion and manifests itself in the field in many different ways. And then I figured out for myself that it's more interesting to talk about the different ways in this, the way it manifests and the way individuals deal with the narratives in their everyday life that is surrounded by Muslims, Jews, Roma, and Christian Germans, and all the different minorities. And that's the way I see the goal of our project, to tell those individual stories and to give this narrative a face.
Yeah, so we're getting already into the Encounters project. I mean, maybe, Sami, you want to tell a little bit about the intentions of the project, because it was actually designed to sort of question those broader narratives and discourses that are at place in those different national contexts.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we thought a lot about was the discursive context in which what we are calling, but perhaps reifying or hardening Jewish-Muslim relations, we thought about the historical context in which such a kind of concept or trope is born, right? And there's, of course, a fairly considerable amount of historical type work on that field. And what we felt was that kind of gave a consistent narrative one way or the other, right? So we've talked about this a lot, the Lacrimose discourse, so the idea that things have always been terrible between Jews and Muslims and they've always been enemies, or the Roseate view that things at times have been wonderful, al-Andalus, convivencia, convivir, living together. That historical material is there, but the lived relationality, those relations on the ground, that daily interaction, those relationships, those friendships, those couples that may have formed, that was kind of missing from the picture. And that, of course, is incredibly complex, and it subverts a lot of the nationalist order and the kind of orthodoxy of one neat national line, right? So, of course, it upsets that, but that was one of the sort of core aims of the project, to show that ethnographic richness. Of course, then we get into the very micro analysis, and we come across all of the individual complexities of being both part of a community, having those, what you were exploring, that double pressure. On one hand, you have a kind of the discursive weight of your own community and a certain expectation. On the other hand, there are expectations upon you as a neutral researcher. So, I would kind of temper, of course, there is fantastic scientific work, but we are also very much, at least from an ethnographic perspective, involved in the field and have our own feelings. And I think that, and are all fallible also, and sometimes fail in our mission to be the objective researcher, and end up kind of an evening, sat on a pavement feeling very sad. So I think that, yeah, I mean, the objective of being a sterling scientist and neutral is also an ideal. It's not a reality.
Yeah, but I thought we'd left that idea behind of the neutral researcher long ago. But what I hear is...
Yeah, I agree.
Sorry.
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, I would not strive for objectivity, but for intersubjectivity. One thing, to make clear the positionality, to make clear also the normative stances. And I mean, this is what I find so shocking in Nonna Mayer's account of France, that the accusation is that researchers would support terrorism. And I think what I truly very dearly believe that what I'm doing is doing the opposite and understanding why people join, for instance, extremist groups, why people take extremist stances, opposing other people because of the group they belong to or they assume they belong to. I mean, to me, it's really difficult to understand. I think I didn't get that yet. But I think to try why this happens and what are the social and structural factors that lead to that, I think this is so important to do. And this is a really important work, also in this context of a very, very polarized and difficult society, which is facing terrorism, which is facing populism, etc. And so I think, yes, I'm not neutral. I'm very positioned. And one of the major positions for me is human rights. I mean, I think Nonna Mayer has also positioned herself already. Is human rights is our basic law, for instance. I mean, these are very clear points. And in education, I mean, looking at textbooks, for instance, I also have very, very clear positionality, which I think is important to make, to show also when doing research. And for instance, the support of for instance, also the teaching of how to deal with conflicts, I think is very, very important. And therefore, what you do, looking into how do people deal with the conflict and not denying the conflict or making up a conflict. I mean, that's, I think, so important, so that we have a chance as researchers to speak about the conflicts without making a scandal out of it, but really looking into how do people deal with that and how could that even, for instance, be supported. For me, that would be very interesting. How could that be supported by education, for instance, by actors in schools or outside of schools? So yes, I think that's crucial, and that's not neutral.
No, it's not. Of course, it's not neutral, and I think what I was hearing is also that you navigate two different spheres. One is your participants who are also navigating the minefield, and then making sense of that and your own positionality towards it. So, as you said, it's not objective, but it needs to be positioned. But that I imagine that once the political climate changes, that can be quite difficult, as Nonna has pointed out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe we can hear a little bit more about examples from the field, from the ongoing research. Maybe you have stories to share where you come actually close or on the edge to those navigations and where it becomes difficult.
Yeah, I personally find the field of music very interesting because the general perception of music would be one of a world where there is no language, at least not there's a more universal language, even though that in itself is not true. Music is different in different cultures, but there's this certain perception that music supposedly would be something that is neutral, that musicians can then connect through that. And in my conversations with musicians in Berlin, I've discovered that it's a very complex world. It's a world where, which is in Berlin also very much shaped by the conflict, because a lot of these musicians on the Jewish side are Israelis, and a lot of the musicians on the Muslim side come from are Arabs, so the conflict is closer than, let's say, other Jewish Muslim groups. And also the Oriental music scene in comparison to Paris, which is also in our being researched, is not so deep. It's not people who came from North Africa and brought this music with them, at least the Jewish side, but it's a place where there's this encounter between Israelis and Arab musicians, where that question of do Israelis belong to the Middle East through that music when they play that music. So this question of belonging is then raised. And when an Israeli musician is playing this music, what does it mean? Is it cultural appropriation? When they play that exact music, what does that actually mean to play a homage to Arab musicians? Does it mean that you copy them? Does it mean that you cover them? Is it easier to actually make new music, being inspired from that music? Questions of what does that mean when an Israeli musician is on the stage with an Arab musician for the general public around these musicians? Well, then putting pressure on them from their own communities. Can you participate? Can you not participate? Does it require a political message in participation? Even in the term of iconology, where sometimes you would have for language, you would put a flag. But what happens when you put a flag of Israel or a flag of Palestine, just to say that this is somebody who comes from that place? So every small gesture on stage or behind the stage or on social media gains a lot of meaning within that context, and is also shaped by different events and by what is happening in German culture at that time. If it's 2016 when refugees are now coming, or if it's 2019 where you have an already more established Arab music scene in the city. So it's complex and it's changing.
So if I could just talk about Paris and the example of the Maghreb, North Africa, El Maghreb, right, in Arabic. I think it's important. You were talking about personal conflict and working through personal conflict and how that manifests itself in interpersonal conflict. And one of the things that I've thought through for a long time, more than a decade, is the question of intergenerational transmission, so the passing down of memories and ways of being between generations of North African Jews in familial circumstances, and the proximity of that overall history, or those histories, with North African Maghrebi Muslim populations, and their French Muslim descendants of those populations. And in a way, we were discussing this earlier, across generations, some of the traumas of the departures from North Africa or the Middle East are get worked through at the intergeneration. Right? There's a lot of psychoanalytical work that's done on this. The first generation tries to integrate and change the way they are, and adopt the language and the practices and the cultural codes. And the generation after that kind of thinks, but hold on, we live here, why don't we have equal rights, or at least why aren't we recognized in the same way, right? So I've been thinking through the ways in which those histories are both parallel, but they're similar, but they're also dissimilar, right? And music and food, of course, and humor, and of course some remnants of Arabic, Derija, North African Arabic, are the ways in which a lot of this conflict gets worked through at the intergeneration. And I see kind of parallels with Berlin, but it also, like, one of the things that we conceptualized in the Encounters project was, you know, France is it's been a land of l'accueil, so it's brought in refugees and migrants for a longer period than Germany, and Germany is only more recently a post-migrant, quote-unquote, post-migrant society, and France has kind of been working through what that means for a longer period of time. So that kind of that top-down national narrative and how that works through on the everyday. So the music and the work and the playing together, or even if it's not playing together, it's playing each other's music, right? And recognizing that this is stuff that they listen to and we listen to, right? And that makes us a little bit similar, right? And that makes us look a little bit different as well. Is part of the dynamics of this kind of this conflict that is lent to what Jewish-Muslim relations represent, right? I mean, it's not a discourse I buy. I think the whole problem with Jewish-Muslim relations is that it kind of comes from this perspective that we're trying to solve a conflict, when maybe it's actually more complicated. It's more, there are more layers, historical, personal, experiential, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
And I think it's really important that you pointed at those different layers and the different sensitivities that groups have as a matter of trauma, but also the colonial past that we haven't really engaged with, but it's specific in France. And then it's a question of how you represent those groups and do you do justice to their own sensitivities and trauma. So that's another minefield, I suppose, challenge.
I think Nonna wanted to say something.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, I'd like to go a little further on the research in Sarcelles and the research for the National Commission of Human Rights, because what's interesting is that in Sarcelles we had open questions, and they're very interesting because they show us what people really think beyond the formatted answers. And we had one about the languages you talk at home, and only 20% of our sample only spoke French. And it's fantastic because we have languages from all over the world. So that was a very nice multicultural thing. And two, we had a question about their origin. How would you define the origin, your family? And there it's fantastic because you see that Sarcelles is really a multicultural city, but that it obliges you to deconstruct the identity. Practically none of them had only one identity. They had multiple identity. They had histories that went from all over the world. So that's also something to, so how do you define a Jew? How do you define a Muslim? You can not reduce people to Jew or Muslim. That's the second thing we learned in Sarcelles. And three, we had experiments. You know, you split the sample and you ask the same story, but in different forms. And it was amusing to see. One of them, it was Vincent Tiberi, my colleague who had the idea. We asked, according to your religion, are there moments where the laws of your religion are superior to the laws of the state? And when, if you were a Jew, it was the Torah. If you were a Muslim, it was the Quran and the Evangels. And there's quite a debate in France and many surveys who show that the most intransigeant, the most non-compromising religiously are the Muslims. Well, it's not true. We saw that it was the case in all religion of the most practicing, but that the level, the proportion of people who said the laws of my religion count more than those of the Republic. First, there were a minority. Two, there were as many among Muslims than among Catholics. So there's really things interesting to see when you go a little deeper. And the last thing, we talk a lot, of course, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And since the Second Intifada, the level of anti-Semitic actions and aggressions rises at every turn of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And yet, when you looked at the opinions, it's not the conflict that structures the opinion. When we ask questions about the conflict, we have a majority of people who don't answer or to reject Israeli and Palestinian side to side. They're tired of the conflict. What really matters, and we try to show it, is it's the old stereotypes. It's the idea that Jews have too much money and that Jews have too much power and they have an unequal weight. So that's really important to try to disentangle all the pathos that there is around the conflict. That's not the most important issue, not even in Sarcelles.
Yeah, thank you, Nonna. Does anyone want to respond to that immediately? Otherwise, I would like to open up to our audience here and ask whether you have questions to the panel, you want to bring in your own perspective on the question. Please. I think we'll take the audience first, and then we'll go online and ask the online audience to also comment. Yeah, Karen.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. I think I got lots of ideas and impressions. Yeah, maybe two questions, if I may. I was wondering, I mean, the Encounters project seems to be telling us a different story than we usually hear, because, I mean, there's so much like this Muslim Christian or Muslim Jewish, and all these stories are often told as very much an affair of diplomacy and official meetings of representatives and something very formalized. And you seem to be telling a story of everyday encounters that are far less problematic than one would assume. Still, I mean, my impression from the public debates is that, and also the conflicts, that one major issue is whether there is a chance that we can achieve a recognition of the different experiences of discrimination and racism alongside each other, or make people not compete for who is the most discriminated against group, which I think often happens and is politically very unfortunate, but do you see a chance that people are willing to open up and invent a new story that recognizes that? And to Riem, I wonder, I mean, given you are doing research on Islamist extremism, right? Aren't you often accused of doing that at all from the left? I mean, I personally, I wouldn't do it because I would be too afraid of this being abused by the right. And aren't people telling you quite often that you just by doing that you are shedding the wrong light, or you putting a bad image on Muslims altogether? Or what experiences are you making there?
I mean, I can say for I like the question of the story, because it's also, as I started with the introduction, there is a lot here about the dynamics of the story shifting. I'm not sure if I would be saying the word inventing a new story. I think a lot about it is about sharing the story and the possibility of people bringing their own story to share in the story being told. Specifically, I'm speaking now on the narrative level, the story of the Holocaust, and the Holocaust as a story of a civilization rupture, that for a lot of people coming, speaking specifically people coming from Syria and from other countries, this was not the only civilization rupture. They experienced a civilization rupture, and they want this story to be heard. They want to feel that they can tell this story, and they would be happy to do it in a language in which it could be understood, which is the story of the Holocaust and discrimination of Jews. This is also a story the Turkish communities have been trying to speak through the discrimination, and a story of integration also. So it's not just the Holocaust, it's a story of integration of Jews in Germany, which but of course the question you're asking is a question of how much space can be given. And does the competitive victimhood block that space? I don't think I can forecast that here. That's exactly the question that is being negotiated. On the personal level, there is other stories being told, which are stories of personal migration that is being shared by Jews and Muslims in Germany, and very often in the stories that I receive, a lot of Israelis and a lot of Muslims say, or immigrants from Arab countries, so I don't want to say that they feel that they're actually sharing a similar experience that they can speak about much better than an Israeli would be able to speak with a Jew who has been born here, who relates to antisemitism differently, relates to Muslims differently, or that a Turk who has immigrated 3 years ago would feels more connected with the Israeli immigrant than they would with a Turk who was born here, who speaks a different language. So also, the personal stories that are being told are ones of a shared experience and a shared story.
I would actually add the question to, I would be very interested in the Maghrebian experiences, whether ascription is done, if you're from Turkey, whether you're Christian, we have a rather large Christian, Turkish or Assyrian community in Berlin that I've never came across actually, because that's never really talked about, by the way. Whether you're Christian or Jewish or, communist or something else, right? Or Baha'i or whatever, you're most probably being addressed in school, on the workplace, on the street, maybe as a Muslim, because Turkish means Muslim in the discourse, right? So I wonder whether that's similar in the Maghreb or in the Maghrebian communities in France, and then I will come to my answer.
Okay, so there's a kind of genealogy to that. So there's like a history to the words that have been used to identify that kind of metatrope of alterity, so that absolute difference. So today it's the Muslim, yesterday it was le Maghrébin, before that it was the Arab. I think you can trace that through fairly, and yes, there's a particular salience about le Maghreb because it's, because Algeria was French for 132 years. Basic historical facts, right? And because there was such a huge amount of migration movement from Algeria to France. And that, in a sense, a lot of anthropologists have written about this, Algeria exists in France, and France exists in Algeria, and it will always be that way. But it's an unsolved conflict, and it's a personal conflict, and it's an interpersonal conflict. So, yes, completely to answer your question. But there's definitely a specificity about that history that runs through this kind of larger question about Jewish-Muslim relations, to my mind, that makes it a French specificity, but it has resonances with obviously, this is why I'm talking about there are different temporalities. In Germany, the kinds of stories that are being shared that Dekel is listening to and himself a part of, they are being told today amongst people who, you know, may have arrived in the last 20, 25 years. You know, l'histoire maghrébine, this kind of that long history has been kind of ongoing for some time in France. But those tropes are really embedded, and I think, you know, at the beginning when Nonna was sketching out Islamo-gauchisme, so Islamic leftism, and that as being like the absolute kind of worst thing that you can be called, right? And public, it's like a public humiliation, you know, and that Nonna herself went through, and that, you know, I hope she can kind of tell us a bit about how horrible a thing that is. This all reposes on that long history, and that those tropes of the ways in which le Maghrébin became l'Arabe, became the Muslim today, right? But at the same time, there's this parallel history, a Jewish history that's very rich, that's also from North Africa, and that can be kind of counterposed with, and already pluralizes and complexifies that history. And in a sense, this is, to my mind, this is a kind of, this is almost a debate about France's future, the way it sees itself. So, yeah, sorry to get a little bit meta.
And also who gets recognized in the public sphere.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think that's an issue, what Dekel mentioned in Germany as well. Yeah. But now it's Riem's turn.
My question, the difficult question. Maybe I'm not a real researcher on radical Islam. So I use the time of your answer to think about probably 15 years. Since 15 years or more, I'm more interested or more researching knowledge production about radical Islam, about Salafism, about Muslims and Islam, or about other minorities as well. So just in the last 5 to 6 years in textbooks and educational context, but before that in research, like who gets questions as Islam or as Muslim in academic research, what are our intelligence services write about Salafism, or who gets counted as Salafist, for instance, in the Verfassungsschutzberichte, which I find really interesting. And how do we actually talk about these issues, and how, for instance, which is just looking at the textbook now, at the school textbook, how does the Islamist propaganda or interpretations gets access to our knowledge, our common knowledge, and how, for instance, intelligence services and educational material are legitimizing extremist positions. Just it's a very, very short gap. So I usually don't get that accusations, but I'm not sure. I was just thinking about my colleagues who really do research on radical Islam, or even or go into doing interviews or observations in communities that are maybe at least ambivalent, and I don't think they get that. But probably some of them do, but I don't think that that's a real issue. I mean, at least, and I wouldn't think that. I mean, I'm very careful whatever I write, how it could be used. And I mean, this does give me stomach ache all the time. I mean, whether I write about knowledge production or about Muslim communities and what they debate about, or, you know, I mean, that does give me stomach ache before a publication comes out. I mean, it used to much more when I was younger in my academic career, right? And I think it's good. It's good that we get sweating hands and so on. I mean, because I mean, I do also take do no harm very, very serious, because I don't want to be responsible for somebody not getting a citizenship or not getting asylum, for instance. I think that's a very, very severe consequence that our work actually can have. So yes, I think we do work in a field where we have a lot of responsibility But I've never heard any. To me, maybe the severity of my belief was questioned, and I will not reveal which one it was. But maybe that happened every now and then, but I don't mind that either. Or the kind of my belief, I find it very interesting that what people Google, apparently, about positionality, but yeah, no, not really. I think the severe, I mean, I would be afraid of doing research in extremist contexts, and I think it's not my job. But I think what I heard from researchers that I know of is rather from the right, so that death threats, etc., come rather from the populist or from the right-wing side so far.
Yeah, thank you, Riem, and also pointing out the responsibility of the researcher, but also the fears that one goes through when publishing. I think that's really important also when it comes to discussing this topic. We also, I don't see an immediate question. There is one, and then we'll have to go to our dear online audience, whom I have neglected for now. Thank you for watching, by the way, and the next question is to the online audience, but now we have Sanja.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your fascinating insights into that. And I think it's a fascinating project, and I know you are still very in the middle of it, but I was wondering if you can share more of the empirical insights of these encounters, and maybe also first insights into your analysis, or also you do this in different countries. What are surprising things that you are observing in these encounters, and what if you can tell us a little bit more about these stories, because a lot was on a more meta level of the conversation. I'm really interested to hear, and then in the future, of course, also read more about these encounters that you are observing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, we've been speaking about that a great deal today at the Institute, which is always very, very productive and fruitful. I mean, I'm going to unfortunately give you a little bit of a meta-level answer, but just to kind of break down the ways in which we're looking at this and the spheres in which these encounters may occur. So I think you'll have heard, and maybe you can give some kind of specific anecdotal depth, I mean, up to you, but you'll have heard that the artistic and the cultural sphere is important to this project, and that's one area that I think we have kind of gradually moved towards as a project, as a group of researchers, with the feeling that whilst sometimes there is institutional orchestration of those kinds of encounters, and that sometimes they have to do with funding and the way that you want to sell your music or sell your theatre or indeed get kind of buy-in from funding. It's also quite organic in the way that it's constructed. It has longevity, so people work together for longer periods of time. And clearly, it exists across the three countries, be that in a kind of klezmer fusion type ambiance in London or in Manchester, or Maghrebi music in Paris or Marseille or Strasbourg. There's some wonderful research by Anis Farigi, who's gone on to become a lecturer at Lille, but he did some wonderful research on individual musicians that collaborated together and the ways in which that kind of made a significant impact on the ways they thought about their patterns of identification as as kind of increasingly plural, but in tandem with that kind of musical encounter. And then, of course, there is very much the institutional, right, the interfaith, right, which is, I think, Karen, what you were talking about. We see the rabbi with the imam shaking hands, and it's kind of normative, kind of mainstream, very much established leadership, often male figures. And it's interesting because we've been talking about that today and how that kind of normativity keys into many different ways in which the nation constructs those relations, right? And the national context is incredibly important to that. And of course, that varies throughout the three countries, and then kind of changes even further in the 6 different cities: Manchester, London, Paris, Strasbourg, Frankfurt, and Berlin.
So what was surprising?
Well, I think what was surprising. What was surprising? You know, I mean, the surprises come, I think, from the thick descriptions that you uncover, right? From the stories, from the depth of feeling that people kind of throw at you and that you weren't necessarily expecting. So I think, I mean, it's interesting because Karen's kind of answered that question, right? You're giving a story that that is not often heard. It's totally unsurprising to me, but it may be from the outside, right? So I guess we're having this discussion about what is staged encounter, what is not staged encounter. You know, what is kind of organic. So anyway, sorry, Dekel.
Thank you for giving me time also.
Okay, yeah, no.
But I think we kind of move over to the online question, and then you get a chance to answer.
Sorry, I get my pen.
Yes, I'd like to add something too.
Do you want to go for it, Nonna?
Nonna, we can hear the online question?
Yeah.
Yes, I think we'll take them, and then you get a chance to answer, and Dekel as well.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure listening to you. I'm also part of the Encounters project. I'm Arndt Emmerich from the University of Heidelberg. I have the honor to monitor our chat today. And it was actually, there's a very avid person in the chat, Lisa, who asked 2 very important questions for our project, I think, and which we also have encountered in our field work. So the first one, to summarize, is: can we do the research on Jewish-Muslim encounters without speaking about the church? So her question is, what is actually the role of the Christian in the encounters research, both in terms of discursively as a reference point in dialogues between Jews and Muslims, but also as a real actor in the field. And so she also wants to know what the difference between France and Germany is regarding the role of the church, or maybe a wider question, the role of brokerage, because Jewish-Muslim relations don't just happen in a bilateral field. There are many stakeholders who are trying to claim representation, trying to influence representation, whether it's mainline church actors or state actors and so on. I think that's a question which is very vital. Thank you, Lisa. And the second question is, again, given that we're often using the frame or the overall arch of interreligious exchange and dialogue, by doing that, do we run into the possibility that we exclude a lot of other spheres, such as the cultural sphere, the secular sphere, and the non-religious sphere? And yeah, I think these questions relate very nicely to each other.
Thank you. And who wants to go first? Nonna?
You want to take on the chair?
Okay. Well, I'd like to answer the 2 things, because that's something I wanted to say before. I think it's not only the interface, the religious sphere. What's very important, and in line with the work of the Gordon Allport, the psychologist, it's the contact, it's the things you do together. It's to dance together, make music together, learn the language of the other together, to the point where you don't see the other as a Jew or a Muslim, just as another person, just as a friend. So that's, for me, as important as the interfaith, which is sometimes things coming from the top and not from the bottom. The other thing, of course, the Catholic Church in France, it's important, and there are associations such as the Fraternity of Abraham, but I don't think it's very active today. And also our surveys of the National Commission for Human Rights show us there has been a change among the Catholics. There was a moment where they were very tolerant, where they had condemned, for instance, Jean-Marie Le Pen and his positions as contrary to the message of the Gospels. Well, they don't do that anymore. And since the cartoon affairs in 2005, they have turned the practicing Catholics in our samples more intolerant. So I'm not sure that it's so simple to have a fraternity between the three religions today. Islam is perceived as a very dynamic religion, more and more visible in the public space, and which is seen as in competition sometimes with a declining Catholic Church.
Directly to that, or the questions?
I mean, the church. So we research both religious as well as secular and cultural encounters. I don't think this is something that we neglect. Vice versa. The role of the church is there. And I think Nonna's last remark really reminded me of an encounter where that issue of attracting young people to the places of prayer was really a difference where Jews and Muslims actually bonded in that conversation and didn't feel a part of that Christian plight for the future. Just didn't understand what's the issue and why are we a part of this this issue. But of course, the question of Christian is it's the meta level, it's the narrative, it's always there. When I talked before about this bonding of an Israeli and Turkish migrant, in some ways this bonding is also clinging to each other vis-a-vis majority society. It doesn't necessarily mean they become best friends, but it is actually an expression of a feeling of estrangement from mainstream society that is embracing the other as a figure of similarity, as a figure of familiarity, and it helps me in a way also understand my own migration story, my choices that I made arriving in Berlin, choosing to live in a neighborhood that is more Muslim, because this is a place that I just felt that I blend in. So it's also helping for me. And I am in that sense my own case study. Surprises. I'm going to tell more anecdotes than empiric surprises. It's one, because it's not on that stage, also because that's the things that first come up to mind. And one surprise is that it's not a big deal. Like the whole Jewish-Muslim issue, for most people I talk to in their everyday life, it's just not an issue. And when they come to Berlin, they see there is a lot of conflicts in Berlin between a lot of different groups that, I wouldn't say shape the city more or less, but they're also there in their presence. And for many, they understand this is just another issue amongst many different issues. Another surprise is Russian-speaking Muslims. I didn't expect that to be an issue, that Russian is actually a language that connects both Jews from the Soviet Union that make up the majority of Jews living in Germany, with Jews from Tajikistan, from the Kafkas, and that not only is this a story of encounters there, that for many in their family histories in the Soviet Union, intermarriage with Jews and Muslims was a part of it. Empirically speaking, it was probably not so high, but it is definitely something that for them is a reality which they brought with them to Berlin. Another surprise is Tinder, and the way Tinder as a social, I wasn't expecting it to be a social media platform that would be so relevant, but it comes up in anecdotes, in people's stories, whereas the Tinder dates, I wouldn't really call them dates, what happens usually. It's really about the encounter. It's a way to have a meeting, which also has this gender difference in it. So it's a very specific kind of meeting, but it's more about the encounter than it is about, let's say, sexuality in the stories that I have, most of the stories that I have heard. And another surprising field for me is the nightlife. So Berlin is known as being a nightlife destination, and that the nightlife can be actually a field of entrepreneurship for encounter, where it's not supported by social policy, but that there are people who are willing to say, I'm willing to put money on board, and I believe that we are able to create a place together that will be a place of encounter, and that maybe is also unique to Berlin because of what Berlin is today.
Yeah, thank you, Dekel, for those insights. I see we have no more questions from the audience, and we also have to come to an end. Right now, if there's anything pressing that you want to add at this point, but I would like to thank this great panel for your insights and for the great discussion. Thank you, Nonna, for joining us online, and yeah, sad that you couldn't be here in person. Thanks to the audience in presence, and thanks to the online audience, and have a good evening and see you soon.
Thank you.